Jesus, God, why? I'm standing there, my wife's standing there. He kind of walked over here, and then when I look, he's got the gun in his hands. And I was like, David, whoa, dude, what are you doing? And then he kind of waved it around and looked at her, and he fired the trigger.
I was hesitating. I was really hesitating. I couldn't even pull out of the driveway to do it, man.
To do what?
To go and kill Tatiana.
What?
For Jesus, oh my God. Lord, I don't even know how to pay any God.
Oh my God, what? No. Please.
Dad!
Oh my God. David, she's gone.
I killed her.
The shotgun blast echoes through the living room. Adriana Olsen drops to the floor. Her husband Aaron stands frozen in the doorway, staring at their son David, who still has the weapon in his hands. David begins to scream, but this wasn't an accident, and the person he really wanted dead was someone else entirely. April 8, 2022, Pensacola, Florida. Aaron Olsen walks into his family home, expecting to calm down a domestic dispute. Instead, he witnesses something no parent should ever see. His 18-year-old son David, standing over his wife's body with a smoking shotgun. Within minutes, both father and son are separated into interrogation rooms. Aaron is hysterical, barely able to form sentences. David, meanwhile, is singing hymns, convinced he can bring his mother back to life through prayer. But as detectives begin peeling back the layers of this tragedy, they realize something is deeply wrong. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't self-defense. This was calculated, planned, and the intended victim, she's still alive. David Olsen wasn't always a killer. By all accounts, he was a bright kid with a future ahead of him. He was weeks away from graduating high school. He had plans to get a car, start a job, maybe even go to college. His teachers described him as intelligent, but troubled. His friends knew him as quiet, introspective, someone who kept to himself. But beneath the surface, David was drowning. He had been diagnosed with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, ADHD, and an anxiety disorder. His mind was a battlefield of intrusive thoughts, violent, terrifying images that he couldn't control. These weren't fleeting concerns. They were relentless, overwhelming. The kind of thoughts that make you question your own sanity. For years, he'd been seeing psychologists and psychiatrists, trying to manage the chaos inside his head. Medications were prescribed, therapy sessions scheduled, coping mechanisms taught, but mental illness doesn't follow a linear path. And then his parents' marriage began to fall apart. Aaron and Adriana Olsen had been together for years, but recently, cracks had formed. Arguments became more frequent. The tension in the house became unbearable. David watched it all happen. Every fight, every cold shoulder, every moment of resentment building between the two people he loved most. Finally, his parents decided to separate. Aaron moved out to stay with his aunt across town. Adriana stayed in the family home with David. The decision was framed as temporary, a cooling-off period. But David knew better. For David, this separation was devastating. His mother had always been his emotional anchor. She was empathetic, understanding, supportive. When his intrusive thoughts became too much, She was the one who could talk him down. Adriana wasn't just his mother, she was his lifeline. But it wasn't just the separation that was breaking David, it was what came after. According to David, his mother changed. She became cold, distant. The warmth he had always relied on seemed to evaporate overnight. She stopped talking to him the way she used to. She was out of the house constantly, spending time with her best friend, Tatiana. In David's mind, this wasn't just his mother dealing with a difficult divorce. This was a transformation, a corruption. Something or someone was changing her, and he blamed Tatiana. He convinced himself that Tatiana was poisoning his mother's mind, filling her head with ideas about independence and freedom, and leaving the family behind. In David's fractured perception of reality, Tatiana wasn't supporting his mother through a difficult time. She was orchestrating the family's destruction. And then one day, Adriana told David something that shattered what was left of his world. She pulled him aside, asked if they could keep a secret. Instead of the conversation he hoped for, she told him she was planning to divorce Aaron permanently. No reconciliation. The marriage was over. David felt betrayed. That night marked a turning point. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't control, and slowly, an idea began to form. A terrible, horrifying idea that made perfect sense to his broken mind. If he could just remove the bad influence, maybe his mother would come back. Maybe everything could return to normal. David began to fixate on one solution. Tatiana had to die. It started as an intrusive thought, but this time it didn't fade. It grew stronger, more insistent, more real. His OCD latched onto it, turning it over and over in his mind, until it became an obsession. He began to plan, not impulsively, not in a moment of rage, but methodically, carefully. And then, on April 8, 2022, David decided it was time. He knew where the shotgun was kept. Aaron had bought it months earlier for home protection. The gun was stored in a safe, but David knew the combination. His parents had never hidden it from him. David retrieved the shotgun from its case. He loaded it, 10 shells total. Then he simply placed it in the back of his car, in a case, like he was going to the shooting range. And then he drove. David didn't have a license. He had failed his driving test twice due to anxiety. But on this night, that didn't matter. All that mattered was getting to Tatiana's house and ending the source of his family's destruction. When he arrived at Tatiana's neighborhood, reality hit him. He sat in the driveway, engine running, shotgun in the back seat. He tried to force himself to get out of the car, to walk up to the door, to follow through with the plan, but he couldn't. Not because of morality, not because he suddenly realized murder was wrong, but because in that moment, something deeper stopped him, a hesitation he couldn't explain. Finally, defeated and confused, he put the car in reverse and drove home. When David arrived home, Adriana was there. She had been out with Tatiana earlier, returning a rental car. The house felt different when he walked in, heavier. He was still carrying the shotgun in its case. He didn't try to hide it. He just walked in, placed it near the couch, and sat down. Adriana saw him. saw the case, asked what he was doing with the gun. David didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened the case, pulled out the shotgun, and pointed it at his mother. Adriana's reaction was surprisingly calm. She didn't scream, didn't run. She simply asked again, "David, what are you doing?" David turned the gun on himself, pressed the barrel against his own chest. For a moment, he considered it, but then he lowered the weapon, unloaded it, set the shells on the table, 10 of them, arranged in a neat row. Then he sat down on the floor cross-legged, the unloaded shotgun resting across his lap. Adriana sat on the couch across from him. Neither of them spoke. They just existed in this terrible, suffocating silence. This standoff lasted for almost an hour. During that time, Adriana made a phone call to Aaron. She told him David was acting strange, talking about the gun, talking about hurting himself. She needed him to come over. Aaron was at his aunt's house in Gulf Breeze, about 20 minutes away. He told Adriana he was coming immediately. About 10 minutes later, Adriana called again. Her tone had changed. She sounded calmer. She told Aaron that things had settled down. Maybe he didn't need to rush over, after all. But Aaron was already halfway there, and something in his gut told him not to turn back. He kept driving. When Aaron pulled into the driveway and walked through the front door, the scene appeared deceptively calm. David was sitting on the floor. Adriana was on the couch. No one was yelling, but Aaron noticed the tension immediately. "What's going on, guys?" Aaron asked, trying to keep his voice light. Then David stood up. Aaron didn't see the gun at first, but as David rose, he picked it up, and that's when Aaron's blood ran cold. "David, whoa, dude, what are you doing?" David didn't respond. He just held the gun loosely in his hands, looking at it like he was seeing it for the first time. His face was completely blank. Aaron started moving toward him slowly, hands raised. "David, put the gun down. Come on, man, just put it down." But David wasn't listening. He began to wave the gun around, not aggressively, but erratically, pointing it at his mother, at his father, at himself. What Aaron didn't know was that David had loaded a round into the chamber the moment he heard his father's voice at the door. The gun wasn't just a prop anymore. It was live, ready to fire. "David, seriously, what are you doing?" Aaron's voice was getting louder now, more desperate. David turned toward Adriana. The gun followed his gaze, and then, without warning, without any final words or explanations, David pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. Adriana didn't have time to scream. The impact knocked her backward. She hit the floor hard. David immediately dropped the gun and began screaming. Not words, just raw, anguished sound. Aaron stood frozen for a split second, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Then instinct took over. He ran to the gun, picked it up, carried it outside to his truck. When he came back inside, Adriana was still on the floor. Blood was spreading across the carpet. Aaron dropped to his knees beside her, fumbling for his phone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely dial 911. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics rushed in, assessed Adriana, began working frantically to stabilize her. But even as they worked, Aaron could see it in their faces. Adriana was loaded into the ambulance. Aaron tried to go with her, but the paramedics told him to stay. The police were already on scene and needed to talk to him. David was sitting on the curb, handcuffed, still crying. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to avoid consequences, but genuine, soul-crushing grief. Aaron gave a brief statement to the first responding officers. Then he was asked to come down to the station. The interrogation room was small, cold, and deliberately uncomfortable. Aaron sat at a metal table, his hands clasped in front of him, still trembling. The detectives entered with practiced calm. They introduced themselves, offered condolences, and eased into their questions. Aaron started from the beginning. The phone call from Adriana, the drive to the house, walking in to find David and Adriana in that tense standoff. He described the shooting in clinical terms, like he was narrating someone else's tragedy. But as he talked, something started to feel off. His emotions seemed exaggerated. His grief performed rather than felt. He would cry intensely for a few seconds, then suddenly shift to calm explanation. The detectives noticed. They asked about David's mental health. Aaron admitted his son had issues: severe OCD, ADHD, anxiety, but he claimed he didn't know much about the specifics. He worked all the time, he said. Adriana handled all that stuff. The detectives pressed him on the gun. Why keep a loaded weapon in a house with a mentally unstable teenager? Aaron's explanation was defensive. Home invasions. The gun was for protection. It was kept in a safe. Everyone knew the combination. Then came the phone call from the hospital. Aaron answered immediately, hoping for good news. Instead, he got the worst news possible. Adriana hadn't made it. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. Aaron's reaction was immediate and visceral. He screamed. He sobbed. He begged to see his son. The detectives allowed it, bringing David into the room. Father and son collapsed into each other, crying, praying, and then David started singing Waymaker by Leland, a worship song about miracles. David sang with his eyes closed, swaying slightly, completely lost in the moment. He genuinely believed that if he sang with enough faith, his mother would come back to life. Aaron joined in, not singing, but praying aloud, asking God to intervene. The detectives watched in uncomfortable silence. Minutes passed. The singing continued. Reality remained unchanged. Finally, the detectives needed to move forward. They needed David's statement, so they gently interrupted and asked if David was willing to talk. Aaron encouraged him, told him to be honest, but there was something calculated in the way he said it. David agreed to talk, and what he revealed would change everything. He started with the separation, described how devastating it had been watching his parents' marriage fall apart, how his mother had changed, become cold and distant, how he blamed Tatiana for manipulating her. Then David said something that made everyone in the room go still. I was going to kill Tatiana. Not, I thought about it, but I was going to. Past tense, a plan that had been set in motion. David described taking the shotgun, loading it, driving to Tatiana's house, sitting in the driveway, trying to work up the courage, the hesitation, the return home. the confrontation with his mother, and then he said something even more disturbing. Out of everybody I was going to kill, she was the last person I would have expected to do it to. Everybody. Plural. He had a list. Aaron's face went pale. This wasn't the story he had been telling himself. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was premeditated violence. Multiple intended victims. The detectives shifted their approach. They needed more details. Who else was on the list? Why these specific people? But David's answers were frustratingly vague. The intrusive thoughts had been so overwhelming that he had lost track of where fantasy ended and planning began. What became clear was that this wasn't sudden. David had been spiraling for weeks, maybe months, and everyone around him had somehow missed the signs, or had they? Aaron's behavior during the interrogation suggested he knew more than he was admitting. The way he jumped in to soften David's statements, the way he reframed premeditation as confusion, the way he kept calling it an accident, even after David explicitly said it wasn't. The detectives began to suspect Aaron was trying to protect himself. They asked Aaron about the gun again, about the timing of his arrival, about what he knew regarding David's mental state in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Aaron's answers became more evasive, more defensive. He started deflecting blame to the divorce, to Adriana's friends, to David's mental illness, to anything except his own role. The detectives read David his Miranda rights, explained that he had the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. David was about to continue talking when Aaron leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Immediately, David's demeanor changed. "I want a lawyer." The detectives couldn't hide their frustration. Aaron had coached him. The interrogation was over. David was formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Aaron was free to go. As the detectives escorted David out, Aaron was left alone in the interrogation room, and that's when he started to pray again. But this time, the prayer was different. "Lord, I don't even know how to pay any bills. My wife pays all the bills." In the immediate aftermath of losing his wife, in the minutes after discovering his son was a murderer, Aaron's primary concern wasn't grief. It was practicality. It revealed something the detectives had been sensing throughout the interview. Aaron Olsen was more concerned with survival than justice. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. David was charged with second-degree murder, which in Florida carries a potential life sentence. But David's defense team had a strategy. They built their case around David's mental illness. They brought in Dr. Stephen Zien, a clinical psychologist who specialized in obsessive-compulsive disorders. Dr. Zien testified that David's case was one of the most severe he had encountered in his 30-year career. The intrusive thoughts weren't occasional. They were constant, relentless. David couldn't control them, couldn't make them stop, couldn't distinguish between what was a thought and what was a plan. The defense also highlighted David's age, 18 years old, technically an adult, but neurologically still developing. The prefrontal cortex doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. David's brain was literally not equipped to fully understand the consequences of his actions. The prosecution countered with the facts. David had loaded a gun, driven to someone's house with intent to kill, brought that gun back home, and pointed it at his mother. These weren't the actions of someone completely out of control. These were choices. In the end, it came down to a plea deal. The prosecution didn't want to risk a trial. There was a real chance David could be found not guilty by reason of insanity, which would mean psychiatric treatment instead of prison. So they offered a deal. David would plead no contest to manslaughter instead of murder. The sentence would be 10 years and 4 months. On May 17, 2023, David stood in court and accepted the plea. The judge accepted and handed down the sentence. David showed no emotion. Aaron wept in the gallery. Adriana's family, watching via video call from Brazil, sat in stunned silence. 10 years for killing his own mother. It felt wronged to many people watching. David was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Aaron stayed behind, speaking briefly with reporters. He said he forgave his son, said he believed David was sick, not evil, said he hoped the prison system would get him the mental health treatment he needed. But Aaron never mentioned Adriana, never talked about the woman who died. It was all about David, about his son's future, about redemption and second chances. There were pieces of this story that didn't add up. Why had Aaron left the gun in the house when he knew David was unstable? Why had he moved out, leaving Adriana to deal with their son's declining mental health alone? Why had his grief seemed so performative? Why had he coached David to stop talking to police? And most disturbingly, why did he seem more concerned about bills than the death of his wife? Online sleuths began digging into Aaron's background. What they found was troubling, though not necessarily criminal. Aaron had a history of financial problems, credit card debt, unpaid loans. Adriana had a stable job and managed their finances. She was the one keeping the family afloat economically. Some people theorized that Aaron had a motive beyond just protecting his son. If Adriana had gone through with the divorce, Aaron would have been financially ruined. Child support, alimony, division of assets. But with Adriana dead, Aaron inherited everything: the house, her life insurance, her retirement accounts. And David, the killer, couldn't inherit from his victim. Under Florida's Slayer statute, was it possible Aaron had manipulated David, that he had subtly encouraged his son's paranoia, that he had left the gun accessible, knowing what might happen? There was no proof, no smoking gun, just a pattern of behavior that seemed increasingly suspicious. But Aaron was never charged with anything, never even formally investigated beyond his initial statement. And then there's the question no one has been able to answer, the question that haunts this case more than any other. If David truly believed he could bring his mother back through prayer, if he genuinely thought his worship song would resurrect her, if he was that disconnected from reality in the aftermath, then why did he load the gun in the first place? Miracles don't require bullets. Loading a gun requires deliberate action. You have to retrieve the ammunition, insert it into the chamber, understand the mechanics of how the weapon functions. These aren't reflexive actions. They require planning, intention, conscious thought. And David had done all of this not once, but twice. First, when he planned to kill Tatiana. When that failed, he came home and did it again. Then, when he heard his father's voice at the door, he loaded a round into the chamber. So which is it? Was David too mentally ill to control himself? Or was he lucid enough to plan and execute a murder? The legal system accepted both narratives simultaneously, and it raises uncomfortable questions about how we treat mental illness in the criminal justice system, about where we draw the line between diminished capacity and full culpability. David's OCD was real. His intrusive thoughts were documented. His suffering was genuine. But does that excuse pulling a trigger? Adriana's family would say no. They believe David knew exactly what he was doing. That mental illness might explain his actions, but it doesn't absolve him of responsibility. David's defenders would say the situation is more complicated, that you can't judge someone with severe mental illness by the same standards, that his brain was literally malfunctioning. Both perspectives have validity, and that's what makes this case so difficult to process. There's another theory that's gained traction in online true crime communities, one that's darker and more disturbing. What if David wasn't just a victim of his own mental illness? What if he was also a victim of his father's manipulation? Consider Aaron's behavior. He left the gun in the house. He knew David was struggling, and yet he did nothing to secure the weapon or get David intensive treatment. When Adriana called saying David was having a crisis, Aaron's first thought wasn't to call for psychiatric help. It was to drive over himself. Aaron was the one who had been calling David constantly during the separation. Daily check-ins, where he would talk about how much he was suffering, how much he missed the family. To an impressionable teenager with severe mental illness, those conversations could have been profoundly damaging. What if Aaron planted the seeds? What if he knew David's mind was fertile ground for violent ideation? What if he created the conditions where pulling the trigger became the only solution? It's a conspiracy theory. There's no evidence to support it, but it fits with Aaron's behavior, his lack of genuine grief, his focus on self-preservation, his financial motive. If Aaron had wanted his wife dead, he couldn't have done it himself. But if his mentally ill son did it, that's a tragedy, something Aaron couldn't have prevented. But this theory requires believing that Aaron is a sociopath, capable of weaponizing his own son's mental illness to commit murder. Is that possible? Yes. Is it provable? No. What we're left with is a case that has more questions than answers, a tragedy that could have been prevented at multiple points, but wasn't. A system that failed everyone involved. The mental health system failed David by not providing adequate intervention. The family court system failed by not recognizing the danger. The criminal justice system failed by accepting a plea deal that many feel doesn't serve justice. And gun safety laws failed by allowing a weapon to remain accessible to someone clearly unfit to possess it. Every institution that should have protected this family instead contributed to its destruction. David Olsen is currently incarcerated at a medium security facility in North Florida. He's been a model prisoner, attends therapy sessions, takes his medication. He's scheduled for release in 2033, when he'll be in his late 20s. Aaron has disappeared from public view. He sold the house where the shooting occurred, moved to another state, changed his phone number. He doesn't do interviews, doesn't speak publicly about what happened. Some see this as appropriate, a man trying to move on from trauma. Others see it as suspicious, a man running from guilt. Adriana's family in Brazil has been more vocal. They believe justice wasn't served. They believe 10 years isn't enough. They believe Aaron knows more than he's saying, but they have no legal recourse. The truth about what happened on April 8, 2022, died with Adriana Olsen. Everything else is just interpretation, just competing narratives about mental illness, family dysfunction, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. What we do know is this: a woman who tried to escape a toxic marriage was killed for it. Her son pulled the trigger, but the weapon was loaded by years of dysfunction, neglect, and untreated mental illness, and her husband walked away with everything: her assets, her insurance, her home, while her body grew cold in the ground. Is that justice? Is that tragedy? Or is it something darker that we don't have a name for? There's one final detail that deserves attention. In the weeks before the shooting, David had written in a journal found in his room. The entries were disturbing, filled with violent imagery, but there was one passage that stands out. David wrote about feeling like a character in someone else's story, like he was being controlled by forces outside himself, like his actions weren't entirely his own. At first, investigators thought this was just a manifestation of his OCD. But what if it was more literal? What if David genuinely felt like he was being manipulated? The journal entry didn't name anyone, but knowing what we know about Aaron's behavior, it's hard not to wonder, was David describing his mental illness, or was he describing his father? This is the part of true crime that frustrates people most: the unanswered questions, the loose threads, the feeling that there's more to the story, but no way to access it. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe not every mystery gets solved. Maybe not every tragedy has a clear villain and a clear victim. Maybe reality is messier than the narratives we try to impose on it. David Olsen will be released from prison in 2033. He'll be 29 years old. And then what? Does he try to reconnect with Aaron? Does he try to contact Adriana's family? Does he change his name and disappear? All of these futures are possible. None of them seem adequate, because no matter what David does after his release, one fact remains unchanged. Adriana Olsen is dead. She will never see her son graduate, never meet potential grandchildren, never get the chance to heal from the divorce and build a new life. If there's a lesson in this case, it's not a simple one. It's about interconnection, about how dysfunction in one area of life spreads to others, about how untreated illness compounds with family conflict, compounds with access to weapons, until the only possible outcome is tragedy. David's mental illness didn't exist in a vacuum. It was exacerbated by his parents' conflict, by lack of adequate treatment, by the stress of the separation. Remove any one of those factors, and maybe Adriana is still alive. But they weren't removed. They were allowed to compound until the unthinkable became inevitable. Maybe there is no villain. Maybe there are just broken people making broken choices in a broken system. Maybe tragedy doesn't need a mastermind. It just needs neglect, dysfunction, and access to lethal means. Or maybe Aaron Olsen orchestrated the whole thing. Maybe David was just a weapon, and Aaron was the one who pulled the trigger through manipulation. We don't know. We can't know. And that uncertainty is what makes this case so haunting, because somewhere in Florida, David Olsen sits in a cell, counting down the days to freedom, and somewhere else, Aaron Olsen is living his life, spending Adriana's money, and neither of them is talking. And Adriana, she's silent forever. Her voice erased from the story, her perspective lost. All we have are the accounts of the men who survived her, and we're supposed to construct truth from their testimonies alone. That's the real tragedy. Not just that she died, but that her death was narrated entirely by people who benefited from her absence. We'll never know what she was thinking in those final moments. All we know is that she stood in her living room, arms crossed, facing her son, and then she didn't exist anymore. The point is that real life isn't Netflix. Real crime doesn't follow a 3-act structure with a climactic reveal. Sometimes people die for reasons that don't make sense. Sometimes killers get lenient sentences. Sometimes the truth stays buried. And sometimes the most disturbing aspect of a case isn't the violence itself, but the normalcy that preceded it, the ordinary family dysfunction that spiraled into homicide, the mental illness treated as a personal failing, the warning signs that everyone saw but no one acted on. David Olsen killed his mother, that's a fact. But why he killed her, whether he could have been stopped, whether his father shares blame, whether justice was served, those are questions without clear answers. Not every question has an answer. Not every crime has a clear solution. And not every story ends the way we want it to. But we tell them anyway, because somewhere in the telling, in the examination, in the uncomfortable questions, we might find something valuable, a warning, a lesson, a reminder that the line between normal and monstrous is thinner than we'd like to believe.